Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to help support the show by becoming a premium member, please go to dogmanencounters.com/podcast to sign up. Memberships are only $2.99 a month. By becoming a premium member, you'll be able to download episodes onto your mobile device and listen to them commercial-free wherever you go. Also, if you'd like to check out the new Dogman Encounters t-shirt store, please go to dogmanencounters.com/store and take a look around. Buying a t-shirt or sweatshirt there is another great way to help support the show. Well, here we are. It's hard to believe, but tonight's show marks the 200th episode. We're 200 episodes in, but now's definitely not the time to pat ourselves on the back because we haven't accomplished anything yet. There's still way too many eyewitnesses out there who need help. For tonight's show, I decided to break tradition and do things a little differently. It's going to be basically a two-part show. In the first part, I'm going to narrate 4 stories for you. In the second half of the show, I'm going to bring on an eyewitness, Dave, and have him tell you about his encounter. And then after Dave comes on and talks about his encounter, Chris Edge is going to come on and share several encounters that eyewitnesses have shared with him. Before we get underway with tonight's show, though, I just want to thank you as fans of the show so much for listening to the show and helping to support these eyewitnesses the way you do. Alright, let's get to the encounters. Tonight's first encounter took place in Maricopa County, Arizona, and reads, I went on a camping/fishing trip to Lake Roosevelt in Arizona on May 5th, 1999 with my wife, 2 children, both of my in-laws, and their big golden retriever, Buck. We loaded all our things in the boat and crossed the lake to set up camp. No one camps on that side of the lake. It's very remote and wild. It's high desert with Palo Verde trees, mesquite trees, and creosote bush. We found a nice cove and set up camp there. I'm a 6th-generation Arizona native. My ancestors were pioneers who came to Arizona back in the 1830s. My G6 grandfather was Ebenezer Bryce, founder of Bryce Canyon. We're no strangers to the outdoors. My father-in-law is a Big Ten trophy hunter and is a modern-day cowboy who often hunts in Alaska, Africa, and just about every state in the Union. Both of us know what we experienced. This is no case of mistaken identity. Buck was a special breed of golden retriever only found in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. He was much larger than your typical golden retriever. He weighed 150 pounds. His head was very wide and he loved to fight other dogs, especially German shepherds. For some reason, he would immediately attack any German shepherd he saw. In Arizona, where we live up against a mountain, it's very common to walk your dog without a leash, and dogs would often fight. Buck only ever lost one dog fight, and that was with a Great Dane. Buck had a unique method of fighting. When the 2 dogs would charge one another, right before contact, Buck would jump in the air and turn around in midair and land on the other dog's back, biting down on the neck. That would immediately bring the other dog down. He wasn't vicious, he would just bring the other dog down and hold it until it gave up. We have a cabin up north by Flagstaff, and sometimes coyotes would come close. When they did that, Buck would go out and fight them. He would come back with blood on him, but usually it wasn't his own. He even took down a deer one time. He was a great dog and lived to be 17 years old. My father-in-law is so much a cowboy that when Buck could hardly walk anymore, he dug a hole and told Buck to get into it. When Buck got in the hole, my father-in-law said his goodbyes and blew Buck's brains out. So that you know, there's a reason why I'm explaining so much about Buck. On to what happened. We had already set up camp and the women and kids were in the tent sleeping. My father-in-law, Buck, and I were fishing late for catfish. We were in this small cove on the left side. We were both just sitting in our chairs with fishing poles in our hands. Buck was laying down by our feet. All of a sudden, Buck started to whine and pace back and forth like he didn't know what to do. Then he just bolted away from us into the desert and trees behind us with his tail between his legs. My father-in-law and I were bewildered, not understanding why Buck had done that. The cove we were in was surrounded by hills all behind us and on the other side of the cove. About 5 minutes after Buck ran off, I started to hear something very large on the other side of the cove from us behind a hill that led down to the shoreline. It was smashing through the trees and brush. It was like it was just walking through whatever was in its way. I could hear big branches snapping and that whatever it was extremely big. At first I thought it must have been a cow. Then this big black thing on all fours came into view at the top of the hill. The other side of the cove's shoreline was only about 50 feet from us, but the top of the hill over there was about 100 feet from us. This thing was totally black, and now I could hear some noise coming from it. It sounded like very deep growls. I could see its head swaying left and right. It started to come down the hill towards the shoreline opposite us. As it came down, it just didn't look right. At this point, I could see that its back was about 4 feet high. What looked odd to me was that it appeared to be taller in the front than in the back. It wasn't even trying to walk around the trees and brush, it just walked through everything. As it got closer, I could hear big rocks being kicked over as it walked down toward the shore. I could also hear branches being broken and that it was still making a deep, strange growl. It was like I could hear it breathing and growling at the same time. At this point, the only thing my mind registered this to be was a Kodiak or grizzly based on its size and the sounds it was making. The only problem was Arizona doesn't have these types of bears. Because of that, I thought it had to be a black bear. No black bears are in this area of the desert though, and it was too big to be a black bear. When it made it to the shoreline, it started to head along the shore in our direction. At that point, he had a way to go before he would reach us, but now the urgency kicked in and my father-in-law and I both went for our guns. I had my .44 mag pistol close by and my mag light. My father-in-law ran to his truck and grabbed his .357. We then started to walk along the bank toward this thing that still had not yet reached the halfway point. We had to protect the women and kids sleeping in the tent, so we had no choice but to get closer to it. I could see that it was huge, but it was so dark I could only see its outline as it walked along the bank. I could also tell that its front legs looked different than its back legs. I could also see that it had tall ears and a long snout. My mind was racing at that point. I kept wondering, what is this thing? Its head was swaying back and forth and it was grunting and growling the whole time it was walking toward us. When it came around the cove to our side, we were about 25 feet away from it, standing our ground. That's when I pulled back the hammer on my gun and turned on my flashlight. I raised both my gun and my flashlight at the same time. What I saw then almost made me crap my pants. When the light hit its face, it was like it saw us for the first time too. It immediately crouched down like it was going to jump towards us and then opened its huge mouth that seemed to have hundreds of sharp white teeth and let out the loudest roar I've ever heard in my life. My entire body vibrated and I started to shake rapidly. My father-in-law never lifted his gun. He just raised his arms to shield himself from the blast of its roar. It was like a physical force. I still had my gun and light pointed at it, even though I was shaking so badly. It was staring at us at that point, but didn't advance on us. I asked my father-in-law, "Should I shoot? Should I shoot?" He said, hold on. I was actually kind of frozen. I'm not sure if I could have squeezed the trigger. What I was seeing wasn't supposed to exist. It just stared at us and then slowly turned around and started heading back the way it came. I kept the light on it and we watched it walk along the bank towards where it came down from the hills. I noticed it had a tail at this point. I also noticed that its front legs were actually like huge human arms. Its back legs were dog-like but gigantic. It glanced back at us from time to time as it worked its way back to where it came down the hill. When it did, I could see intelligence in its eyes. It started to work its way back up the hill, but this time it appeared to me that it was only walking on its two back legs. It was still hunched over quite a bit, but I could see its arms grabbing tree branches and moving things out of its way. It was like it didn't need its two front legs/arms to walk. As it got closer to the top of the hill, it was standing fully erect on its two back legs. As it got to the top of the hill, it stood there with its back to us for a minute. It was like it was thinking, do I want to go or not? I was thinking, just go, please go. Then it grunted and continued walking away. We could hear it plowing through the desert like it didn't care what was in its way. This thing had to be at least 8 to 9 feet tall and was just massive. By this time, my wife and mother-in-law came out of the tent with my kids, asking what was that? I was in shock and didn't know what to say. My father-in-law just said, "It's okay, it was just a little bear, but we scared it off. You can all go back to sleep." Chris and I will stay up and make sure it doesn't come back." One of the kids asked, "Where's Buck?" Again he said, "Buck's chasing the bear away. Don't worry, he'll be back." After they all went back to sleep, I remember sitting in the chair next to my father-in-law. Neither of us said a word for about half an hour. Finally, we looked at each other and I said, "What the was that?" He said, "I have no idea what that was." We didn't sleep a wink that night. Buck finally came back and my father-in-law gave him a lot of trouble for leaving us like that. He looked like a scared puppy and seemed sad for disappointing us, but I don't blame him. Time, 1 a.m. Date, May 5th, 1999. Signed, Chris Hildebrand. The next two stories come from the Scottish Highlands. In January, a man contacted me to let me know about problems he and his family had been having with dogmen there. Unfortunately, I've lost contact with him though and can't reach him. I hope he's okay. The first report he submitted reads, "We have a family branch farm, as you may choose to call it. We work 4 miles from the nearest town. We keep to ourselves and that's the way we like it. Apart from farming, I'm a local fire officer and my brother works up and down the country on the roads. We had been working late to get our winter plowing done. We were running behind due to some of our land having extra drainage put in. We have to work when it's dry enough to get on the land. My brother had been plowing in a 60-acre field we have way beyond in the middle of a wooded area. We were used to seeing deer and wildlife up there, seeing as there's no one around for miles. We have radios for communication when we plow the land, as telephone communication is poor back there. It was around 12 midnight when my brother seemed rather spooked and said over the radio that he had heard what sounded like howling close by. We had been hearing strange howls for some time at that point, but it always seemed to be far away. There aren't any wolves around or any other predators that would make sounds like that, so we've always been on edge since we started hearing those strange howls. We also wouldn't go alone to the remote parts of our land, especially without a machine like a tractor with us. He said the howling was carrying on longer than usual and that it also seemed to be closer than usual. He actually said it was unnervingly close. He wanted to know whether or not I was close and if I'd want to call it a night and go home. I also think he wanted to make sure he could be heard for a little reassurance. I was only about a mile away, arrowing with the other tractor. I was frightened but also interested in finding out what it was, so I headed his way. As I got closer to him, there was no mistake the howling was close and it seemed to be just behind the woodline. Talking between ourselves on the radio, we both for some reason decided to head toward it. As we did, we pointed both of our tractor's headlights and working lights into the woods where the sound was coming from. To our terror, when we drove into the woods, there they were, 2 black werewolves. There was no mistaking these things for anything else. They were crouched over eating a deer. They had most likely killed it. They had obviously known we were there, but for whatever reason they had decided to leave us be. That was until we interfered by shining our lights on them. When we lit them up, they both stopped what they were doing and looked straight at us. That's when my brother said, "Do you think they can get at us in here?" I said, "Oh yeah," and we started reversing our tractors at the same time. We both obviously had the same idea, and both of us were terrified out of our minds, wishing we had never gone in there to investigate what had been making those howling sounds. As we were backing our tractors out of the woods, they began to make their way toward us. Their eyes were a yellowish color. Their fur was jet black in color, though. Whoever likened them to German Shepherd dogs, though, we must have run into 2 totally different creatures. This was no dog. My brother and I were both in big tractors, I mean like 9-ton machines, and they were looking straight into the cab at us at eye level. That put them at around 8 feet tall. There's nothing out there anywhere that could have possibly tangled with these things. A bear, a tiger, nothing. These are alpha predators. It was as if they were communicating with one another and were rounding us up. One had instantly disappeared. I asked my brother where it had gone. He said, "It's right behind us." I slammed on the brakes and shifted into a forward gear. I was going to try to run it down. I leaned on the throttle as hard as I could. My 9-liter turbo diesel tractor jumped forward, and that's when I heard my brother say over the radio, "Right behind you! Go, go, go!" When I tried to look behind me, all I could see was the glare of his headlights in my mirrors. Then he said, "It's beside you, keep going." There was one way into those woods and one way out, and that was through an overgrown thicket down man-made tracks that big wheels of our machines had made over the years. All I could see was blackness on either side of us and nothing else as the wood folded around us, making like a tunnel of branches. I was leading the way out of there. We couldn't go any faster than we were going because at the speed we were already going, we were bouncing around in our cab so much we would have been at risk of hitting our heads and being thrown around the cabs of our tractors if we did go any faster. We just made our way on the 20-minute ride through the trees and moorland woods toward the road that would lead us back to the farm. Our houses were a source of safety, if you like. They're still keeping with us, I heard my brother say as I saw one cross the path very close in front of me. I had visions of it jumping on the side steps or the bonnet and smashing the front window. I was so frightened, I thought I was dead for sure. Over the next 20 minutes to the main road, they both kept with us. I saw blood-stained faces as they came into and out of view on our lights. We eventually made it to the road, and when we did, they both stood upright on two legs, watching us leave as fast as we could. Never have we felt so much fear and adrenaline in our lives. We definitely won't be out at night now that we know what's out there. The kids aren't allowed out without someone with them. I just sent for my shotgun license and we're considering selling our property and moving. We still hear the howls and see shadows occasionally. The difference is, now we know what it is. Not good. Beware. This world isn't all it seems. That's from someone who's now a believer. The second encounter I received from that family reads, Me and my brother John were doing our usual work. It was late at night. Our land is in the middle of a valley in a 900-acre wooded land. We were doing some winter work. We had been hearing weird howling and growling noises, so we were aware that there was something abnormal lurking around. At times, our guard dogs would set off barking, snarling, and acting generally uneasy, which was out of character for them. We arrived home at around 11:30 p.m. to an uncanny smell of blood and wet dog. We knew the smell of blood as we have butchered our own animals when it had to be done in an emergency as to not waste the meat. As we emerged from the farmyard, we were met by the remains and unsightly sight of our German Shepherd and Ridgeback dogs which had been ripped limb from limb. These were not only pets, they were fierce, fearless guard dogs too. As we were digesting the sight, we heard what could have only been meat being ripped from bone and the sounds of crunching bone. Now panic set in. All the fear turned to panic, and I started to hurry around the side of our farmhouse where the external security light was already on. When I did that, to my astonishment, I saw that the bull in the holding pen was being torn to pieces by what could only be described as a freaking werewolf. I froze momentarily, watching this thing ripping apart this half-ton bull. It seemed to be in a testosterone-fueled rage. As I was watching it tear through the flesh of the bull it had already killed alongside two of my 3 guard dogs, I kicked a metal bucket which was alongside the wall of my farmhouse. That alerted the thing to my presence. When it heard me kick that bucket, it snapped its head around and looked straight at me. It was lit up really well. Its yellow eyes pierced right through me. When it turned its attention on me, I realized that my brother was standing right behind me looking on in horror of what was happening. Together, we bolted for the farmhouse door, not looking back. Luckily, right before we got to it, the door opened. It was my wife. She was watching and saw what was going on. She said she didn't know whether to use the radio or the phone to ring and alert me because the creature might have heard them ring and become aware I was there. She quickly bolted the door behind us. No sooner had she done that when we could hear it sniffing and clawing at the door, looking for a way in. There we all sat with our backs against the door, looking at each other in frightened disbelief. Finally, it went quiet for a moment. Emma, my wife, whispered quietly, "Has it gone?" When she said that, I thought about the back door and ran for it. When I hit the back door, it was already there. Lucky for us, it was locked, which was a godsend. We have solid old-style stable doors, and we usually leave the top open. Luckily, this time it was locked. We watched as the outline of a 2-legged beast that could only be described as a werewolf's shadowy figure could be seen walking around our house looking in the small old-style farmhouse windows. Our landline was always on the blink, and due to our remote location, our mobile phones often wouldn't get a signal. This was real, and we were in trouble. My brother John asked me if I had a gun. John had been working alongside me when this occurred. I told him yes, it's in the brick shed. The shed was 40 yards or more away from the house, though. There was one upstairs, but we never kept ammo in the house. Everything went quiet outside, but we didn't dare move because something was telling us it was waiting and listening, looking for a weakness. The cellar. There was a way in through the cellar. My fear was answered as I heard something moving and growling beneath us. It was in the cellar already. It had already gotten in our home. We were screwed. I said, "Quick, the trap door. Put something on top of it. Bolt it. Keep it there. We may be able to reach the ranger or at least make it to the tractor." At that point, I saw my dad pull up. We had to warn him, but how? We had to do something or he was toast for sure. Dad's door opened, but as he stepped out, he must have seen the dogs were laying there dead and all of the blood. As the door of his truck flung shut, my phone began to ring. Thank goodness he got the message. This encounter happened in Cook County, Illinois, and reads, "My experience happened in October of 1993 in Willow Springs Woods. I was 17 years old. Being foolish high school kids, my friends and I would go to the woods to party and drink. I had some great times in the woods. We would build campfires and sometimes we'd stay up till sunup. Oftentimes there would be up to 50 kids in the woods. We normally did this on Saturday nights. The path leading up to the clearing was about 3/4 of a mile on a gravel road. On this particular evening, 2 of my girlfriends and I were walking up the trail when all of a sudden, we all stopped in our tracks. It was obvious that something was watching us, so we stopped and got very quiet, looked at each other, and decided that we were just freaked out because it was really dark that night. It was unusually cold for October, and there was a small amount of snow on the ground. It was fall, so there were no leaves on the trees. As the 3 of us continued up the gravel path, we all stopped again in unison. This time we heard rustling in the tree line off to our right. We tried to explain it away, saying maybe it was a couple of our guy friends trying to scare us. Once again, we continued on with a case of Budweiser. We just wanted to get to the clearing, hoping that when we got there, our guy friends would be laughing because they had scared us. That wasn't the case, though. We made it probably another 30 feet up the gravel path and heard the same rustling sounds in the tree line. This time, when we looked, we all saw it. This thing we saw was kind of crouched next to a tree. It was really dark, but you could clearly see it was massive. It glared at us as all 3 of us stood perfectly still for what seemed like forever. It was clear that it had seen us. It seemed like it was following us. It looked like a cross between a dog, a human, and a kangaroo. Now I say kangaroo because when it ran off into the woods, it seemed to hop in big strides like a kangaroo would. This creature was covered in hair. It was muscular up top but had odd-looking arms and hands. Its hind legs looked like those of a dog and it had a thinner waist. The face was like that of a dog with a shorter muzzle and its eyes were reddish in color. Its eyes were frightening and looked truly evil. It had what appeared to be a longer strip of hair that ran down its neck all the way down its back. This hair appeared to be standing up. Its ears were pointed and had tufts of hair at their tips. Once we all saw it, we froze, stood still, and after a few long moments it darted off into the woods. We took off running back up the gravel trail to our car. We raced out of there and headed to our friend's house who lived a short distance away. We were hoping that our friends wouldn't be home because if they weren't home, there was a small chance that it was them trying to scare us. All 3 of us were in shock. We couldn't believe what we had seen. Our friends were home and could see how scared we were. When we told them what we had seen, we all agreed not to go back to the woods that night. After that, we often went back to the woods trying to find that creature again, but never did. I still dream about it and have often felt compelled to sketch that creature. If I had been alone, I'm not so sure I would have believed what I had seen that night. Over the years, I've searched for information about that mysterious creature, but have found nothing until now. I believe I saw a dogman. Time, 9:30 p.m. Date, October of 1993.
My name's Dave. I had a Dogman encounter in July 1993 at a YMCA day camp. I remember the year and the time more because it was before my birthday and it was after Jurassic Park came out because that was what just about everybody at it was talking about. And as a 9-year-old, well, dinosaurs. But it was a camp where you get there in the morning, leave late in the afternoon, probably for parents who worked. But in the morning, we'd go down to the woods, play tag. The YMCA itself was built up at the top of a hill. Then you'd go down with different layers down the hill where they'd leveled it out for different play fields and an outdoor pool and other things. And at the bottom, you had a huge woods area that split between some clearings and more dense woods, along with a rather large rocky creek that wound along the property edge between the Y's property and a old farmer's land that was undeveloped on the other side. So while there was the tag going on, tag or capture the flag, I think it was capture the flag actually, but those of us who didn't want to play because there really weren't any rules on hiding the flag or anything else, it just turned into a run around and wander. So I went in the creek because somebody had found a newt down there a couple of days before. So if there were newts and frogs and things, I was a 9-year-old boy, one of the interesting things to look at. But as I wandered down it, there was a semi-natural dam at the end of a creek, pond, or lake. I'm not quite sure which it technically was, where you had to climb up the rocks to get to it. And when I got there, that's when I saw this dog. It was on the edge of a large rock on the other side of it. At first, I thought it was just a dog sitting there, well, halfway between sitting and laying with its paws hanging off the rock. And I just stopped, and I thought it was a large wolf at first, but then I realized there's not wolves in that part of Ohio, except for at the zoo and similar places. So from there I went, okay, it's a large dog, and we'd been told repeatedly, don't go into the farmer's land because he has a bunch of big aggressive dogs that he lets out. Apparently there may have been a beware of dogs sign or something, but not right along there in the woods. But I just stood there, I froze, staring at it, and that's when I saw it move. There's a big splash, and it caught a fish in between its hands, and then I realized it wasn't a dog because it stood up on its hind legs. And that's when I stepped back wondering what the heck this thing was. And at the time, I didn't know about what a werewolf was either. I just knew dogs weren't supposed to be able to walk on their hind legs. And when I stepped back, I hit the edge of a rock and I fell on my rear and made a loud sound. Guess enough that it realized I was there, because its ears at first had been flat back along its head. But when I fell and made the noise, its ears popped up. At first I thought it suddenly had horns, but when it turned, I could see that they were ears. And at the time I thought I was staring it right in the eyes. Well, it was staring at me, but now I don't think that I couldn't really see eyes. I could see a shadow from the brows, the way its head was. But when it saw me, it dropped the fish onto the rock. We just stared at each other. I didn't move. It didn't move until I think the fish bumped into its ankle and it realized it dropped the fish. And it jerked and grabbed the fish and ran off one way while I kind of realized I had better get out of there too and ran the other way, freaking out about what was this thing that I saw. And I remember that its fur was bulked up around the chest, the neck, and part of the head, and along the forearms, down the hands when it was standing up. The fur along the forearms was down and soaked at that point, but it was like a ivory or white belly, I'm not entirely sure, from both the shadows, and it may have been dirt, it may have been whatever, but it went from a pale ivory to a reddish brown to a dark brown to either continuing that or a black right at the strip along the back from nose to tail. But I ran to one of the voice counselors, their 5 counselors for the group, 2 for the guys, 2 for the girls, and 1 person that was in charge of all of them. That was the only person there that I think was full-time employed by the Y. The others, I think, were just there for the summer. But he was telling me, don't talk about where you saw this, don't talk about it. You just saw one of the neighbor's dogs. We don't want to get in trouble for kids caught trespassing and everything else. But then he walked off to talk to the guy that was in charge. And then they started gathering everybody up, saying that, oh, there's thunder. We have to go up to the building, and we'll stay there until we get the all clear that it's not going to thunder. It was at the time it was a clear day, but they gathered everybody and moved up there. And I don't know where the thunder part came from, other than it was an excuse to get everybody up. Because the next day we were told, oh, there's reports of thunderstorms. We're just having an indoor day, and that they had a week-long camp that they ran at the same time that had some cabins down by the woods, but they moved everybody from there up into the building for the night. But after that day was over, I tried telling my mom and my brother about what happened. And my mom just told me that it was my imagination, don't talk about it, don't try to scare your brother. And other times I tried to tell my cousins about it and was told, don't try to scare them with it. It didn't happen. It had to have been your imagination. There's no such thing as werewolves. And at the time, the only thing with werewolves that I knew of was it's all a type of Halloween mask. Until later, there really wasn't anything on TV at the time for me to really know what a werewolf was. My parents were kind of protective about what they'd show. But it wasn't until a couple years ago when Monster Quest was on, and my brother saw it and remembered the story about it, and called me to tell me that there were other people who had seen this Dogman thing and had me turn it on. From there, I had a name to start looking at what this thing was, because I still remembered it. I didn't know what it was. It didn't really scare me that much. It was more of a strange animal thing that I just wanted to know what it was, and I kept on looking to try to figure out what it was, because it didn't match anything that was being shown on TV or any books with monsters or like. And I knew it wasn't a werewolf. There wasn't a full moon. Oh, that was something else that the counselor had commented on. Don't joke about it being a werewolf. It's not even a full moon, so it couldn't be one. But from there, it was more of just trying to get it out of my head to figure out what this thing was. Something that sticks with you. One of the things that reminds me of so many things that I learned from my dad, where dogs don't challenge one by staring them in the eyes if you don't know the dog and know it's not going to attack you. So that has hit me a lot. But that was my encounter.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Edge. I am a Dogman Researcher in the state of New Jersey. I've been researching Dogman for the past several years now, beginning in 2009, with my interest beginning in werewolf movies. I watched all the classics from American Werewolf in London to The Howling to Ginger Snaps, all the classics. And it intrigued me because I was fascinated at the concept that what if these creatures do exist, and what if there is a reality? We go back to Europe in the 1600s and we all go back and hear the stories of werewolves running around, roaming, causing terror back in that time. And to think that if there was an actual real-life werewolf that existed, and even though that those are two different creatures of their own self-entity, and I don't try to compare those two as a similarity or the same creature. So when I first started looking it all up, I just went ahead and I was just very intrigued. I looked up information, and then I took a brief hiatus for a little while, and then I came back a few years later, and then the launch of Dogman Encounters came on, and then basically that's what got my interest back in there, and joined the groups and started doing my research. So basically that's where it all began for me, and where I currently stay now in the field. Now, the encounters that we got tonight, there's a lot of interesting encounters, and this is interesting because the first encounter I'll talk about is coming from the UK. Now, the UK has an interesting set of encounters due to its history. There's no question that the history with Europe and the horror, gothic horror, the whole concept, of course, dating back to the werewolves of the 1600s and whatnot, has a lot of history behind it and a lot of interesting history that's intrigued me. But one story that I've been following lately, and I've been helping out this individual, I'm going to call her Melissa. Melissa lives in the South Yorkshire of the UK. And Melissa has had a very interesting set of encounters and a very weird experiences lately on her property. We go back to the end of last year in December. I had received a message from Melissa herself after she posted a couple photographs on one of the Dogman groups I'm an admin of, that she was discussing a couple of photographs she had was of a light bulb that had been flickering back and forth, and then the specific light bulb had been taken out of the socket a couple times. Her husband put it back in and didn't think nothing much of it, and they had this go on for about a couple nights, and it was then when I suggested to them, well, perhaps maybe you should consider investing in some surveillance cameras, as whatever you can capture on film could possibly be anything you could grab. I wasn't 100% convinced at first that she had a Dogman on her property because of the fact that it sounded more paranormal, or it may have just been a small electrical flare within that built-in system, because the house that she currently resides in is over 100 years old. And any type of history with electrical wiring and whatnot, that was my one theory. And then, of course, it would have been paranormal. And then things began to escalate about a month later, into which she contacted me once more, and that she had purchased surveillance cameras and that she had set them up, and that there hadn't been any activity going on with the light bulb since when they set them up around the margin where that light bulb was getting unscrewed and flickering. And then in the middle of January is when things started getting a little interesting. She had mentioned to me that her exhaust pipe on her Hyundai 8-seater van had been torn apart. The exhaust pipe was ripped out of underneath her car, and it was completely torn apart. It was demolished. The police came out to investigate it. They didn't know what it was. There was claw marks on the exhaust. The mechanic who saw it questioned what it could have been. Some assumed, and even authorities probably thought, that maybe it was a small bump she probably hit, but the claw marks was a mystery to me. And I got a photograph of that too, that she sent to me. And the mechanic even said that he's never seen anything like that. The police never got back to her too, which is a pretty interesting thing. So whatever's around the area, the police are definitely aware of. She even talked to them, considered calling them there and there. And she didn't get no answers, and that's when she was, at this point, convinced that the police can't help you, and the mechanic, he brought the car back and did what he could do, but whatever had ripped the exhaust had to use a lot of strength, because it was ripped out of underneath the chamber area, and it's pretty rough without tools to rip apart, especially, so it had a lot of heavy force, whatever pulled it from underneath. And the husband herself, she said, was baffled, and they went on to purchase more surveillance cameras around their perimeter to make sure whatever was lurking at night, to make sure that it would not come at them, or if there was anything. A little while later, after a little bit of no noise going on, they have a family dog. The dog started to bark very early in the morning, and the husband got out of bed, and he went out with the dog, and the exhaust was just laid on the ground at the back of the car. Nothing else was pretty much said after that. That's how they discovered the exhaust, and that's when that all escalated from there. That happened around 1:30 a.m., so it was roughly around the margin pretty early in the morning. Now, that was the story with the exhaust. The car has since been fixed, and then in the middle of April, she messaged me again. And she told me that her daughter had drawn something that was pretty compelling, looking like it's on its tippy toes. And the daughter reportedly drew this creature. And from what I gather, she had no recollection of any sighting of this creature. Not that I know of, and not that she knows of. I'm pretty sure that she may have had an encounter, or she probably had a dream. It can always work both ways. I would hope it was a dream rather than an encounter, to be quite honest. But that was that. And the daughter has a disability, she mentioned, and she began to make weird noises. And the noises, whatever the case may be, whether they were like howl noises or whatever the case may be. She didn't quite specify, but she did mention that as something that kind of stood out. And then she also mentioned that the title of this drawing she did was The Wolfman. And at the time, and according to Melissa's knowledge that she'd never seen any werewolf movies apart from the Halloween costumes, she was fascinated to show her the drawing, and then the noises she made were like high-pitched shrieks. And she tried to talk to her a little bit. And of course, she didn't want to talk. She would become aggressive and physically attack, clearly due to whatever the disability was, and a common factor, as I've dealt with that in the past with several of my friends in those situations, so I can relate. And that was that story. But it was pretty interesting how she had no knowledge of that. And she titled it The Wolfman, no knowledge of any werewolf movies, no knowledge of any Dogman Encounters. She didn't even know what Dogman is. Not that we know of. And to this day, that's an answer I don't have because I don't know for sure. And then the following day, I asked her if there was a backstory on the house, if there was any history with this house, and that's when I got my answers. She mentioned that the house that she was living in, well, still is, she's actually in the process right now of moving out. So that just goes to show you how crazy this becomes. And the house that she currently lives in was built in 1906. It was a butcher's house with outbuildings and slaughter sheds. That has since been removed. There was also a well that has some water in it. And then there was also in the area some old mining pits. So there wasn't much to it. The butcher part kind of compelled me because perhaps maybe there could have been something with the household, because I feel that this is a creature that's fascinated with her property for some various reason. I don't know the real answer to it because it's kind of confusing at times, because I don't want to go ahead and give someone a piece of information and then it's not an official answer, because it's all I can do is a hypothesis and assumption and question and answer best as possible with this type of situation. But I thought that was pretty interesting with a butcher living there, and it could possibly lead to a history. Who knows? So I was curious to think about that. And she went on to mention about the fact that the situations have become too intense, and that on the 26th of April, she sent me another message, and this time, this is where things got really intense. This is where the last straw came into it. The family dog was freaked out and was constantly barking. It did not leave her side. It virtually laid on her like a cat. She had an immense feeling of dread and fear, which is something very common in these type of situations with Dogman Encounters. She felt like she was going to have a breakdown. The kids were actually concerned as well and were upset for silly reasons, as she mentioned. The daughter who drew the Wolfman was also upset, and that she was sleeping right next to her, and she didn't give explanation why. So now that also convinces me that she may have had an encounter, but I can't be so sure, because if you tried to reason with her or tried to explain to her, as I've mentioned, as what she told me as well, it's hard to get it out of her, or if it leads to physical abuse or whatever the case may be of an attack coming from her. And that's when she began to kind of get a little upset and question why this thing was coming at her. Why is it coming near her house? In these situations, and this is for every researcher out there, and even for enthusiasts, in my opinion, when situations like this escalate, it's very hard to calm down the eyewitness or the person who's having the activity, because it's like convincing people to do a certain task without having a trust issue with someone they don't get along with. And as poor of an example as that may be, the point of the matter is this family has had a lot of activity at the end of last year all the way up to now, and she was vaguely concerned. She actually reached out to the local village vicar, told him everything that went down. The vicar seemed to be understanding. He blessed the house in the early mornings where there's not a lot of activity. This all happens at night. The village where she lives at, there's people that walk, there's people that are always around in the daytime, so she feels comfortable. But at night, it's a totally different thing. And it felt that there was something that she may have did wrong that began that situation. And I told her, I was like, I can't necessarily tell you. And she didn't want to have no researcher in the UK come out to her property because of the fact that it was a pretty intense situation. She felt that it would be best to just talk to me about. And I respect that 100%. And I know some people are like that, and that's understandable. And then on the 30th of April, she eventually confessed to me and revealed that she did not feel comfortable living there anymore. She had taken the kids and taken them to her husband's mom's house. And the fact that they were so terrified of what happened on the Friday evening, when they were woken up by the dog growling and barking downstairs. There was like heavy sound outside the bedroom window and a smashing sound. The husband was terrified. He jumped out of bed and looked out the window and saw that 4 roof slates had been smashed onto the ground. Now, the back door in the kitchen where the bedroom overlooks, there is a lean-to over the kitchen which goes up to the sideways to the bedroom window. They had the windows open for air. The husband didn't go out but shouted to the dog to get in his bed and close the windows. The following morning, they took a look outside. What happened? The 4 roof slates were on the floor, which I have a photo of. She assumed that it was something on the slanted roof by the bedroom. She probably assumed that it was trying to get into the house. I kind of wanted to go on and just say that if it wanted to get into the house, it would have easily broken in. I felt it was probably just messing around or trying to get their attention, into which this is the ultimate decision that they made the confirmation to eventually leave the house, but continue to operate there up until they move, which is going to happen sometime in the summer. But she also mentioned that the cameras that were on the house were facing out. The floodlight next to the kitchen of the back door came on with the slates fallen. The husband and herself decided that it was not safe and that they want to just go ahead and move out. And she mentioned that she felt safe during the daytime. Now, the recent conversation I had with her was in regards to her discussing that by the shed by her house where there was a claw mark. There's a claw mark where she probably assumed that the creature tried to break into the house, or tried to break into the shed, I apologize. And her husband noticed that when he went into the shed, there was this pee bucket that he has normally left behind. And this is basically there if he doesn't want to go into the house, and if he's had a couple of beers, just puts the pee bucket there to urinate. And by the shed door, there was urine sprayed around on the outside, as the smell was horrific, and it wasn't coming from inside the shed. Now, he splashed some urine neutralizer around it, and it wasn't from the dog. They assumed it may have been the dog. The dog could have gotten in there, but I was convinced it wasn't the dog. And that was something that was pretty interesting on my part, but that was the UK story. And I'm still continuing to contact with her to this day, and honestly, it's a very interesting case. It's probably one of the more interesting cases in the UK. And I've given her the best advice to move on and to get it going. And it's interesting to note that she actually contacted the original owners of the house, and she mentioned that she was moving, and the original owners were, in a way, happy. And when she asked the question of, was there any activity by any chance do you guys know of, they never responded. So at this point, it's become clear to me, at least, that this entire property or the village itself has a history behind it. And if this is, of course, a dogman wreaking havoc in the perimeter of this village, that clearly there's something within this village that it is here for, whether it's burial ground or if it's something it likes or fascination with, I don't know. She's never had a face-to-face encounter, but she's questioned it because of the fact of what her daughter drew and the fact that it just didn't make sense to her why this thing was doing what it was doing. But I still continue to keep contact with her to this day because, like I said, I mean, her story is pretty fascinating to me, and it's scary at the same time, especially if you have 4 tiles from your house on the roof be thrown down on the ground, and clearly you hear banging and a lot of activity coming from outside. It's not a peaceful experience, I'll say that. So that's her case. Now, exiting into Europe, from Europe, going into the US, going into New Jersey, it's pretty interesting because ever since I've done my episode with you, in the first episode at least, there was a lot of people that were pretty fascinated by the whole New Jersey Encounters. And thanks to the expansion of more and more folks coming from Jersey into the groups, I'm finding out more and more intel. And some are easily acceptable and understandable to have me share the stories, and some are leery of it because of the fact of ridicule, or they just don't want to, it's a fear thing. They would fear that maybe if they tell the encounter that this creature would come after them, and that's pretty understandable. I've heard that before. But this next story comes from a woman who I'm going to call Andrea. And Andrea's story goes all the way back into the 70s. Now, one of the interesting things about Jersey is that, and this is something that has been happening a whole lot lately, a lot of the logging industry, the construction industry is tearing down woods like crazy. It's insane. Everywhere I go, whether I travel from a different county with a lot of woodland or travel to a county with very little woodland, there's always construction going on. There's always logging. There's always trees being taken down. There's always buildings being created and processed with signs saying coming soon. So for the migration pattern for these creatures to move into the deep woods, it's now they're going to have to reroute their working, because now they're going to be in an area where there's going to be a lot of activity. And God forbid what would be the outcome of that. And these creatures, people, especially people who are brand new to the topic, they'll always sit there and they'll probably see it as, oh, well, it's probably toying with them, or it's a pretty intelligent creature. And in the latter of the two, they are indeed correct that these are pretty intelligent creatures, and that they're not ridiculous enough to go out into the public eye and expose themselves to the public, especially if it's a big creature such as that is very well at hiding in its existence. So I just wanted to throw that out there with the logging industry, because there's a lot of places being torn down, a lot of woodland, a lot of nature, a lot of creatures from deer are migrating out of the area to find more of a deep woodland for survival, and also in the same time for food. And that will also attract the dogman, because where they sense the food, they'll follow it. So in central New Jersey, around Atco, Waterford, and the Hamilton area, there was stories of these teenagers and young adults who would see things running through the woods that they described as Sasquatches. But now an interesting turn on that said that some of the encounters happen to be told of also describing dogs that walk like men in Ocean County. So whether that's an interesting tie in the mix, that there were creatures that worked together as a team and that they walked in a pack alongside Sasquatch, is a possibility. And it also was more fascinating to me because we normally, when we think of Dogman and Sasquatch, we would assume the infamous, well, these two don't like each other. These creatures are two different breeds. They do not care for one another. It's all about territory to them. But there's no question that they work together. There's certain Sasquatches, certain Dogmen that do work together. It's a possibility, and it's been heard of before from various researchers. And if anything, I believe it's been told. So there is an interesting connection between the two creatures. So it wouldn't surprise me if there were, as the story goes, of dogs that walk like men. And there's no description, unfortunately, but if it was mention of a dog, I would assume in the manifestation, or at least in the closest of the canine variants, but I could be wrong on that. I'm just throwing an idea out there. And then Andrea goes on to say that when she used to live in Burlington Township, New Jersey, there was these woods along the Assaskunk SP Creek that she used to roam freely all the time. There is also a small pond in the Uptown Station where she would swim. But every time she'd go into that area, she'd always felt uncomfortable, that she felt that she was never alone. She never felt threatened, though. She never had an encounter face to face, but she felt a presence was watching her. And then, of course, there was also another story that she had been told that there were human-like footprints that were found up in Upton Station one day, and that her mother had become frightened and felt that that was a threat, and that there was no more swimming or no more going into that trail or the creek because of what could go out there. And even though they're human-like footprints, we would assume Sasquatch, there's no question that if there were also sightings of dogmen working in packs with Sasquatch, that there is a small connection to that. So that was her little intake on that. She did mention, though, when she bought a house in 71, that there was a history of Indian burial grounds, that there was an unearthing when they were getting the house built together, that they had seen there was an Indian skeleton in the ground. Now, whether the area itself, even though the areas are not, they're close, but not too close, far from another, maybe that entire land has a lot of activity. It's unknown, but it's pretty interesting. I will say that. So that was her story right there. And I do keep an open mind on that. I do believe that there are Dogmen and Sasquatch that do work together and work in pairs, and that there is a situation going on with them in that part of South Jersey, even though that, as I mentioned, the logging industries and construction industries are working heavily hard to continue building more homes and more businesses. And it's going to be harder for these creatures to migrate and to find new shelter to live in because of the amount of effort and work being put into all of these industries. So it's a possibility that, the population, of course, has increased with them and that it's challenging to move forward. Now, the next story, which happened around Tuckerton, 539 Manahawkin, New Jersey, happened as early as either 2009 or 2010. I'm going to give this girl's name of Angelica. Angelica's encounter happened around that margin, whether it was 2009, 2010. She said several years when I got the encounter last year, but she didn't specify. All she told me was that she was coming home from her boyfriend's at the time. She was driving down 539 Tuckerton, which is in Manahawkin, New Jersey, and she turned around a corner and she saw a creature on its hind legs with a deer in its mouth. Now, this was the one that she gave a description on. She mentioned that it was like a cross between a werewolf and a bear, and that it was over 6 feet tall, that what she would assume, because it was dark out, what it appeared to be. Now, interestingly enough, the coordinates of this location, 539 off of Tuckerton, is a heavily dirted and not much activity on this road. It's a back road. But it would be no question that whatever's out there, that it clearly has enough space to build a shelter to. It's a lot of open land for them. So she mentioned it was a cross between a werewolf and a bear, and there's been the possibility, because I personally believe that there's more than 7 types. It's hard to identify and classify them due to the fact that you don't want to mix up a canine variant 2 with a type 3 variant 3. And it's one of those cases where, for me, I believe in the Dogman, a bear hybrid, which is vaguely seen. There's some stories that we've had submitted into the groups that have kind of resembled a bear man, as they call it, but I'm still open-minded for it to be known as just, a Dogman with a little bit of a bear mixed into it. And she mentioned that, of course, the encounter had freaked her out, and she mentioned it had tall ears like a wolf, which indicated that this was one of the canine variants, perhaps a hybrid version of a different variation. Or it could have just been same with the variants of the 7 as a rubric, as I like to put it out there for that. So that was her encounter, and I had asked her if she wanted to come back to the site, and she said yeah, but I never got a chance to go back, or at least go there. But I would love to go there and take a look and do an entire investigation, see if I can find anything there. But that is, of course, an open question, because there's a lot of private property there. So I don't want to get myself wrapped up in a situation where I would have to end up paying a fine or something like that, because I don't want to PO the state with that type of ordeal. So that's that on her encounter. Now, the next story, the last one I have, is one of a cop who I'm going to give the name of Albert. Albert happened to follow my episode I did with you and followed my Cryptonormal X and Dogman X shows respectively when they were around at the time. And he sent me an email and he said to me, he was like, would it be possible if we could meet up? And I said to him, I was like, well, I'm a little skeptical of some people sometimes, so especially if they are in the law enforcement. And I was like, well, you know what? We can meet up, but I want to meet up somewhere rural, and hopefully, we can discuss whatever you got to discuss. He works for Monmouth County. And basically, Monmouth County is like Freehold Howell Township, for anybody in New Jersey who's familiar with that. And in the 90s, he didn't specify when. He forgot the date, but he recalls the story because he was told this by one of the teenagers a few years later after encountering him at a coffee shop. In the 90s, I assume late 90s, a group of teenagers were driving in Monmouth County off of one of the back roads where they pulled over to the side of the road. The passenger had to go out and go to the bathroom. And when they came back, they were right before a pit stop, but they weren't exactly too far. So it was a back road, but they were close enough to a small little pit stop. But when the passenger came back, one of the girls in the back noticed this giant wolf creature that was coming right at them. Mentioned amber eye shine too. And this creature came so close to them. It reminded me of Stedman's encounter from episode 83, which it nearly opened the front passenger door. And that's when the driver just dove off. He didn't even care if it was a speed limit. He wanted to get out of there. So while this creature almost came at them, and the fact of the matter is that it was basically almost keeping up with the car too, which is the scary part about it. They were on a 45 mile per hour road. They were doing 60. The cop it spoke to had pulled them over and questioned them. Now, the original story was that they had seen a black bear, and that this was the cover-up story because they didn't want to go ahead and tell this cop that, yeah, I saw this weird-looking wolf bear-like creature that had the ability to almost get into this car. So they told them a giant bear. They saw a giant bear, and they were freaked out by this. And it was definitely in the summertime, as the cop mentioned to this. And at the time, the cop just probably felt them. They were just, a little heckling there and there. He asked a couple questions and just said, just beware the speed limit and whatnot. And just to watch it, and that was it. Several years later, one of the teenagers who happened to recognize that officer that night ran into him in a coffee shop, told him the actual story, and said to him, he was like, I apologize if I gave you a false story because you are an official, but this is something that is brutal. That was something that has stuck with us since. And there's only 2 people from that night. There was a group of 4. Only 2 people that night, the passenger and the one girl in the back, to this day, will only talk about it, what he told me, because of the fact that it was traumatizing to the other 2. The other 2 moved out of state, moved close to suburban areas, and they refused to return, basically. So then the cop spoke to him about an encounter around the same margin around the road that they had this encounter on, this back road. The cop told a story about a trucker who was cutting through one night, sometime in the early 2000s, roughly before 06, and this trucker saw a creature to his left on the road just kneeling down, a common thing we've seen with dogmen, and the creature got up and nearly did a big leap. Similar to that, and we've heard this before, with them moving around doing that leap. And the trucker was, if anything, was so close to this creature. I don't know the accurate how many feet, but he was close enough to the point where if he didn't swerve to his left, he would have come colliding with it, and it would have been a very interesting situation. I'm pretty sure if we go back to the Gibson encounter from Bray Road, that running over this creature or doing harm to this creature, that the creature would retaliate. So I guess he didn't want to sit there and want to be dinner for this thing. So he swerved, and luckily there was no other cars around the area, so he drove off. And he eventually ran into the cop and said to him, he was like, look, I got to tell you something. It's going to be crazy. But for a description for both cases, it was a pretty accurate description. The description was 8 feet tall, had pointy ears and yellow eyes, amber eye shine, resembled. Now, here's the interesting thing. I said bear and wolf, but the teenager also mentioned, and at the time, this was before Ginger Snaps in the 90s, so one of the hottest werewolf movies at the time in the 90s, at least in the late 90s, was Bad Moon. And it kind of resembled that, Bad Moon, just with a little bit more of a bear attribute to it. And for the trucker who saw it, he didn't get a good detail because of the fact that he only saw eye shine and the creature as tall as it could be, but he did say roughly from 7 to 8 feet tall from what the cop told me on his story. And as for the Pine Barrens, which of course was the hot spot for my friend's encounter, and to this day, my friend is still traumatized by it. I tried to send him back to the area to go with him on an expedition, and the guy, he, as much as for me being a friend and helping him through the ordeal, because he's the only one he's really spoken to me about it, because he knows what I do. And he, even to this day, when we got to the Pine Barrens, he was so startled, terrified, and we left about a couple minutes later because I wasn't going to put my friend in a situation that was going to make it worse of some case, and it was going to result in something that we'd have to send him to the hospital. And of course, even though that I was with a couple friends at the time, we were doing a camping expedition, but I was in it for a little bit more, which was, of course, research and investigating a little bit with my friend. That was a bust. And it's interesting to note that there seems to be a lot of activity in the Pine Barrens. I don't have any other further stories in the Pine Barrens, but there was a guy that had mentioned to me in the groups that one of the local radio stations around that area mentioned a Sasquatch sighting in the area, as well as going back a few months, I had spoken to an individual from the Pine Barrens who talked about Satanism and a lot of sacrifices and a lot of mysterious creatures seen in the night in certain hotspots of the Pine Barrens besides the Jersey Devil and the Jersey Demon. And it's definitely something in the area. So for New Jersey-wise, this is what I got of an array of stories I'm allowed to tell so far. And this is basically it. But I just wanted to throw the Pine Barrens out there because it's still a pretty creepy hotspot. But other than that, that's basically all my stories.
Well, that's it for tonight's show. Thanks again so much for listening. Have a great night. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you.